This is a story about Colorado about 400 years ago. Today, when you talk about peoples who lived in the United States before it was really discovered by Europe, everybody uses the words Native Americans. But for the legends and stories that have been told for a couple of hundred years, those people have been called Indians. And so I'm going to use the term Indians because that's the way they talked about themselves in books I've read about them. And so I'm just going to use that term so you understand why I'm doing that. Okay? Now, in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado, there lived in the olden times one group of Indians called the Utes. Okay? And they occupied the area from about Grand Junction all the way to Denver, all through the mountains. And there were roughly 7 bands or groups of Utes that lived in these mountains, all in the olden days. Now the Plains Indians, there were plenty of Plains Indians, Cheyenne and Dakota and Pawnee and Blackfoot and Arapaho, all kinds of Plains Indians, but they didn't like to come into the mountains because they weren't comfortable. Out in the plains, you can see things pretty well. In the mountains, you get closed in. And we'll talk about this at another time, but Indians did not like to fight face to face. The best way to attack somebody in the Indian mentality of war was to ambush them and kill them without ever being seen. That was the way they fought. So the Plains Indians didn't like to come into the mountains because they worried about being ambushed without ever being able to see anybody from behind trees and stuff like that. So here you have these Utes living here for hundreds of years in this almost like a paradise. And in the winter, they would move down close to the foothills because the winter wasn't as severe down there. Okay? In the summer, they'd come up to the high mountains and spend all summer up in the high mountains. And it was absolutely incredible. There were lots of fish, birds, and deer and elk, and they were primarily meat eaters, although they had, they ate berries and stuff, but they didn't grow they didn't grow vegetables. And so they were in this paradise where they would spend all summer. And the 7 bands were roughly, figure 40 to 70 people in a band, men, women, and children. They weren't big. And they were scattered all over these mountains. So it was an incredible time for the Ute Indians who lived in the mountains. What I'm going to tell you now is true. Okay? When the highway department was building I-70 across the Colorado mountains, they came to Vail Pass, and they were building I-70 across Vail Pass. They found a summer campground that had been used for hundreds of years by the Ute Indians. Now, the highway department did the coolest thing, I think, probably maybe the coolest thing they've ever done. And that is they got the artifacts out of the campsite. And the artifacts are in museums. But they never told anybody where the campsite is. Nobody knows where it is to this day. And I think that's really cool because people would have gone in and trashed the campsite trying to find more artifacts. So I think it's really cool. None of us know where it is, but it's up there. And this story takes place at that campsite about 400 years ago. Now, in the band that kept coming back to that campsite in the summer, there was a boy who was 10 years old, whose name was Otter. And his sister was 9 years old, and her name was Fawn. Otter and Fawn, usually kids were named by something that happened right around the time they were born. So Otter's dad or mom might have seen an otter about the time he was born, or they might have seen a spotted deer, a baby fawn, about the time Fawn was born. And the kids had those names from when they were born, but there came a time when the boys were able to get a new name, and the girls too. But the boys in particular were able to get a new name when they changed from what the tribe considered to be a boy to what the tribe considered to be a man, or the band. Now, man and boy didn't have anything to do with age or anything. It had to do with a brave deed, with going out and doing a brave deed, something unusual. And that would get the boy recognition as an adult in the tribe, and he would be given a different name. Now, these kids, from the time they were little tiny kids, were taught skills that we don't have. Okay, we just don't have these skills. For instance, the boys, from the time they were about 2 years old, were given little tiny bows and arrows just to their size, so they could kind of shoot them and play with them. And they played with these constantly. And as they got to be a little older, their dad would size the bow and arrows a little bit bigger so that they could always handle them, and they just get according to their size. Now, as they got to be 6, 7, 8 years old, they got to be extremely skilled with a bow and arrow. They were not given arrows with sharp points, with flint arrowheads. They were not given them because kids are kids, and they'd shoot them and break the flint arrowheads against rocks and stuff like that. And arrows were arrowheads were very difficult to make, and arrows were very valuable. The arrows were fletched. Does anybody know what fletching is? Okay. Fletching is the feathers. There are 3 feathers that go on an arrow, right? You remember, you see bows and arrows, you see the feathers. Well, the fletching, made the arrows fly true. So the arrows were fletched. The dads didn't give them an arrow which just the end being just wood, because the kids would shoot it into rocks and trees same way, and the wood would splinter. So they wrapped the end of the arrow with a little bit of rawhide, a little bit of leather, wrapped it up, so when it hit, it still had force, but it wouldn't splinter the shaft of the arrow. Understand? So there were some other things they learned. They learned stalking. Now, stalking is sneaking up on things, people or animals. But the kids learned stalking on animals. And here was the game that they learned to play. They learned to stalk a deer. Okay? Without the deer knowing it, they could touch the deer. Now, that is extremely difficult. And the way you do it is, animals see motion. They don't see, if you stand absolutely dead still, animals don't distinguish you from anything in the forest. But if you move, that's what gets their attention. So stalking a deer required them to move quietly, number one, and number two, only when the deer wasn't looking. And the deer had to be feeding in a meadow or in the forest on grass, and when the deer's head would go down, they could move just a little bit forward. Now, it took a long, long time to become really good at that, okay? But stalking, shooting bows and arrows, tracking, learning to recognize the footprints of animals in the dirt and to follow them and know where they were going and what they were doing while they were going along. Those were skills that the boys learned. Now, the boys learned, they got to be so good with their bows and arrows, by the time they were about 6 or 7, they could shoot a bird in the head from a distance of probably here to the brown board there, accurately, hit them in the head, and it would stun them. The bird would get stunned, and they'd run over, grab the bird, wring its neck, kill it. Now you have something for supper. Now, the bird they practiced on a lot is the stupidest bird in the history of the world. It's called the blue grouse.
The blue grouse.
And it's all over these mountains here. It is the stupidest bird in the history of the world.
I have a comment.
If you shoot with a shotgun, a blue grouse flies up and you shoot today with a shotgun at a blue grouse and miss it, what it does is it coasts along for about, maybe as far as across the width of the soccer field, and then it lands. It's primarily a ground bird. It doesn't fly a whole lot. It lands and starts walking around on the ground. So you can walk up to it again and try and shoot it again. Well, these kids, they'd shoot at it with an arrow, miss it, the bird might fly up a little and come down. They get their arrow and they try it all over again. It gave them lots of practice. So the girls learned different kind of skills. Now, one of the things the girls learned was to take the skin of a deer and scrape off the hair from the outside and scrape off all the fat and stuff from the inside and rub the brains of the deer into the skin. Not only rub them in, but work them in and work them in and work them in, both sides. And what would happen out of that would come the softest leather that you can imagine. The softest, nicest leather to make clothes with or anything. We think we have all this cool stuff these days. We think we got these great soups and everything. They had soups too. The way they would make soup is they would take the stomach of an elk or deer, and the stomach has two holes, one for stuff to go in and one for stuff to go out, right? They tie off one of the holes. They'd clean the stomach out in a stream so it was all clean. And they would put meat and berries and a little bit of water into this container, okay, and with 3 sticks suspended over the coals of a fire. Now you had to be careful not to get it too close, because if it got too close, it'd burn through, out goes all your soup. But they learned exactly the right height, and they would let it sit there for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, and everything would cook inside the stomach, and they'd have soup just as good as any soup we had. We have energy bars. They had something called pemmican. Now, what they would do to make pemmican was they would dry meat, get it all dry in the sun, little bits of meat, chop it up, dry it up, and they would get berries and dry all kinds of berries, blueberries and huckleberries and all kinds of berries, and mix it all together in a kind of a
like mixer,
like a sort of like a pancake mix, sort of. And then over that they would pour heated bone marrow. Now, does anybody know what bone marrow is? Okay, bone marrow is the fluid inside your bones. Okay? Or heated fat. And they'd mix it together, and the bone marrow or the fat would dry, and you would have a solid piece of food. Pemmican would last 2 years before it would spoil. We think we're so cool. They were very cool too. And it was highly energetic. It's like an energy bar. Highly energetic. So if they were going on a long trip, they'd have pemmican with them. They didn't have time to hunt along the way. And the pemmican was like energy bars. Healthy and very good for them to sustain them on trips. And the girls learned how to go out and get particular plants from the side of streams that would have healing, that they could either boil up to make kind of a tea. They learned all these skills. Well, now, Fawn learned all this stuff, but the other thing was that Fawn loved to shoot the bow and arrow. And so along with all the other things she learned, Fawn practiced with Otter all while she was growing up, and she became, by age 9, as good as any of the boys at shooting the bow and arrow. Better than some of them, as good as the best. She was really, really good. So it was one day in about what we would consider about July in the summer, and the camp was up on what we now call Vail Pass, and Otter came to Fawn. He said, tomorrow I'm leaving on a brave deed. And she said, can I go with you? And he said, yes. Now, usually you didn't go on a brave deed until you were about 13, 14 maybe. He was 10. She was 9. And so the next morning at 2 in the morning, if you were in their tent, their teepee, okay, if you were awake and if your eyes had been extremely sharp, you wouldn't have heard anything. But you might have seen 2 shadows, 2 figures move to the front of the tent and disappear, be gone. And it was Otter and Fawn. Their skills were so good, we probably wouldn't have even if we were awake, seen them go. And they each took 3 pairs of moccasins, plus the moccasins they were wearing. And the reason they did that was that moccasins were made with soft leather on the top and the hardest leather, thickest, hardest leather they could make on the bottom, but they would wear out walking on rocks and dirt and stuff like that. Moccasins wear out. Well, they didn't have time traveling to sew on new soles on the moccasins, so they just trade them for a new pair and put the used pair, carry the used pair, and when they got to a place where they were settled, they'd cut off the old soles of the moccasins, sew on new hard sole. And so they each took 3 pairs of moccasins. They took a sleeping robe, a light sleeping robe. They took their bows and arrows, and they took some pemmican. And they left. And the first day they walked through the mountains from 2 a.m. until about 6 or 7. It started to get dark. In the summer, it stays light late. And they set camp by a stream. And Otter sat down and made a fire from nothing in about 5 minutes. And the way he made the fire was he got a piece of wood in the forest that was softwood. And out of his quiver, where his arrows were, he pulled out a piece of quite hardwood, a round shaft of hardwood about that long. And it had a point on the end of it. And with his flint knife, he scraped a little hole in the softwood. And then he took his bow, and they did not carry their bows strung. They never strung their bows. That is, they never put the string on their bows until they were ready to shoot, because the pressure, the constant pressure of the string on a bow would cause the bow to weaken. So they only strung the bows when they were ready to shoot. Okay? So when he strung the bow, he put a loop of the bowstring around this shaft of wood. And he held his hand on top of the shaft, and with his bow, with his right hand, he moved back and forth, which caused because the string of the bow was wrapped around the shaft, it caused this piece of wood to spin. And it started spinning faster and faster and faster against the soft wood down in the hole. And in about a minute, a little bit of smoke came up, and he had some very, very dry pieces of very, very dry powdery wood. A little bit of smoke came up. He kept going. A little flame appeared, and he put the dry powdery wood, and he had a fire. That fast. About a minute, about 3 minutes from start to finish. Well, while he was doing that, Fawn went to the little stream and lay down full length along the side of the stream, right at the side of the stream. Now the stream was coming along, and the stream under the bank had a little cutout under the bank. In other words, the bank came down, and it was a little cut out place where the water was flowing under the bank. And so she lay down full length, right on the edge of the bank, and she put her hand back behind her and slid it forward under the bank, in the water, under the bank, right under her. Very, very slowly, she slid it forward, very, very slowly, and she felt a fish. Now, I have done this. The key thing you cannot do when this happens is to move your hand. You can't jerk. Because if you jerk, fish is gone. Your hand has got to feel the fish and not move at all. Just keep sliding up the body of the fish, up the body of the fish, towards the head. And the fish is pointing upstream. Because the way they get oxygen is by water flowing through their mouths and through their gills. So they always face upstream. And so she slid her hand, until she got to where the gills were, stuck her thumb in the gills, and flipped the fish out. She caught a fish that big, about a foot long. Okay? In another about 10 minutes, she moved a little bit on the stream. She caught 2 more. Almost by the time Otter had his fire really going, she was back with 3 fish for them for supper. Now what they did was, she went down to the stream where there was some mud, and it was a clay kind of a mud. And what they did was, they took the guts out of the fish, okay? Then they covered the fish from front to back, completely covered them with this clay mud. The fire had burned down to coals. They raked the coals away, put the clay-covered fish in the coals, raked the coals back over the top of them, and waited about 30 minutes. Well, what happened is that the mud hardens, okay, gets really hard, and the fish cooks inside the mud. Today we do it with foil. So it's what we do when we're backpacking and stuff and we catch fish. We do it with foil. Same exact thing. They did it with clay mud. So after about 30-35 minutes, scrape the coals away with a stick. Here are these kind of hard mud, 3 hard oblong mud fish. They tap the mud, it breaks away, and they've got delicious fish inside the mud. Okay? So they had that night. They went to sleep. The next morning they got up and they walked again all day. And this time when they camped, Fawn made the fire and Otter went hunting. And he came back with 2 big bluegrass. Didn't take him very long. Stupidest birds in the mountains. Went out and knocked them out, wrung their neck, came back, and they roasted them like you would a chicken over the coals of the fire. Very, very delicious. Had a great supper.
With the steak. I know, I do.
Right. 3rd day, they walk all day, and towards about noon, they came to a long valley with steep sides on either side. A long valley that went away from them and had a dead end at the end of the valley. It was enclosed. And there was a stream running down the middle of it. And they walked all afternoon to the end of the valley. And they were looking at not exactly a cliff, but a very steep hillside that went up, which was the end of the valley, up to rocks up above. And there were steep hillsides coming down all around the valley. It was kind of like a U shaped. And there were trees at the bottom of the steep hillside, and the stream was coming along. And so Otter said, this is where we're going to camp. And so Fawn set about, and he said, we're going to be here for several days. So she set about making a fire, and he went out, and he came back with 2 rabbits, which he'd shot in the head, run up before they had time to figure themselves out, wrung their necks, killed them, and he threw one rabbit over by the tree and gutted the other rabbit, and they roasted that rabbit, and that's what they had for supper with some pemmican that night. And then he said they were going to be leaving early in the morning. And so at about 2 o'clock in the morning, they were up. They didn't cook anything. They didn't do anything. They took their bows and arrows, left everything except their bows and arrows, and started climbing the hill. And they climbed until about 5 o'clock in the morning. And the sun wasn't quite coming up, but it was starting to get a little bit light in the east, which was behind them. And they came to a flat area of ground surrounded by steep, almost cliffs. Well, not quite as big as this classroom, but a flat area of ground that was covered with sagebrush. On the left-hand side was a big jumble of big rocks that had fallen off a cliff. And on the right-hand side, about 50 feet up a steep rock cliff, was a huge pile of sticks that Fawn had noticed the day before when they were walking down the valley. And they got to this flat area, and Otter had brought the second dead rabbit attached to a long piece of rawhide rope. Rawhide is woven leather, okay, around his waist. And he gave Fawn his bow and arrows, and he said, go in these rocks. There's a place there where the rocks are kind of tilted together where she could get out of sight. He said, go in there and wait. And he went out to the middle of this open area, and he lay down in the sagebrush. Now, the sagebrush was about 3 feet high, and it's really scratchy and hard and, really nasty kind of stuff if you're around it. And he lay down flat on the ground so that the sagebrush was over the top of him, okay? And he took the rabbit, and he had tied the rabbit's 2 back legs very, very tightly together with this rawhide string. It's not a rope and it's not a string. It's stronger than that. And he put it up on the sagebrush on top of him, right over his chest, okay? And the rawhide rope had a loop on the other end of it, and it was about 8 feet long, that he put around his right wrist. And then he lay back on the ground, kind of like this. He just lay there. He didn't move. And Fawn is watching from the rocks and wondering what's going on. And at about 5:30, it was pretty light. The sun hadn't quite come up, but it was quite light. The sun would be up in another 15 minutes. And she's looking around. She isn't moving. She's looking around, and all of a sudden, up on the pile of sticks, she sees an enormous bald eagle. Enormous. Almost 4 feet high from the top of its head. Really big. And he's up on the sticks, looking up the valley behind her, not moving. And he had the white head and the huge yellow beak. And he's standing there, and she realizes that the pile of sticks is an eagle's nest. And so she watches, and the eagle stands there looking up the valley, never looks down at them, never does anything except stand there. And in about 20 minutes, as the sun comes up, he launches and takes a few flaps of his wings and then floats, because eagles use air currents. They do fly with they do flap their wings, but they use air currents. And he flew away up the valley, disappeared out of sight. And so Otter hadn't moved. She hadn't moved. 2 hours goes by. And the eagle comes back. All of a sudden, he comes back. And in his talons, he has a huge trout. Big trout.
How big?
Out of a lake. Probably about a 25-inch trout. It's about 2 feet long. And probably weighed 5 pounds.
Whoa.
Now, eagles have incredibly sharp eyesight. They can see a fish close to the surface of a lake from a mile away. Okay? So what they do is they spot the fish swimming close to the surface, and they make a long gliding dive down, and they come along the surface of the water, and they got to grab them. And then they got to flap their wings really hard, because eagles are not swimming birds. They got to beat their wings and lift them out of the water and not get tipped over or have a wing catch in the water, because if they go in the water, they're dead, right? And they got to lift the fish out and take off. Okay, so it's a real interesting process, and they're really good at it, but you got to get a fish close to the water. So the eagle flies up and lands on the nest and starts tearing this fish with his beak and its one leg, holding it with one leg and tearing the fish to pieces and dropping bits of meat into the nest. Well, all this squawking starts. Squawking like crazy starts. And Fawn realizes there's lots of little eagles in there. And they're squawking and carrying on. And in about 5 minutes, that huge trout completely gone down in the nest. But the squawking keeps going because the little eagles haven't had enough. So the eagle turns around, faces up valley, sits for about 15 minutes, takes off again. And more or less now, it's more or less about around 8:30 in the morning. And 2 hours goes by. And the eagle comes back, this time with a blue grouse in its talons, a big blue grouse. And the blue grouse had somehow flown up, which they don't usually do, and the eagle had spotted him. And this time he just dive bombed him. So he brought the blue grouse back, ripped it to shreds, and dropped all the meat and everything into the nest, squawking like crazy. The little eagles are squawking like crazy in there, and they eat that blue grouse in no time flat. So the eagle, by now, it's more or less 10 or 11 o'clock. The eagle takes off again. He's gone for a couple hours. Now, get this picture here. Otter's been lying there since 5 in the morning. He hasn't moved. Bugs, it's getting hot. Bugs are crawling around his face, up his nose, in his ears. Okay? He hasn't moved. Now, I ask you guys to think about lying flat on the floor, on a comfortable floor,
Like this.
for 10 minutes. Much less what we're at now is about 6 hours. He hadn't moved. So the eagle comes back at more or less 1 o'clock. Nothing. Doesn't have anything. The little eagle starts squawking like crazy. He's got no food for him. Takes off again. Comes back about 3:30, 4 o'clock. Nothing. The little eagles are going crazy. Takes off again and comes back about 6. Nothing. Now the little eagles haven't been fed for a long time, and they're going nuts. So the eagle turns around and faces up the valley. So now we're almost 12 hours. It is over 12 hours Otter's been lying there. And the eagle faces up the valley. And then he launches. And he goes out about 100 yards and turns. And starts flapping his wings and sets on a pretty fast glide and comes in towards the flat area with the sagebrush. And just before he gets to the rabbit lying on top of the sagebrush, he sets his talons forward and hits the rabbit and locks his talons into the body of the dead rabbit and then starts beating his wings and taking off. And he rises up, and as he gets about 6 feet up in the air, Otter grabs the rope and pulls down as hard as he can, and he brings the eagle with the rabbit and everything right down on top of him on the sagebrush, right down on top of him. The eagle starts beating its wings and starts screeching, and Otter reaches up with his left hand and grabs one of the eagle's legs and holds him down. The eagle immediately, with his beak, starts attacking that arm, and with its free leg as it can, because it's off balance, it's beating its wings, dust is coming up, and this beak is raking Otter's arm. With his other arm, he's trying to get feathers from the eagle's wing, and this commotion is incredible. Dust is coming up all over everywhere. The eagle is screeching, beating its wings. Its wingspan was about 7 to 8 feet from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. A huge eagle, beating the sagebrush, screeching, and in a minute, 2 minutes, Otter's got cuts in his arm to the bone, okay, on his forearm, down to his elbow. And blood running out, the eagle screeching, and when Otter can't stand the pain anymore, he lets go of that leg and with his right hand grabs the other leg and starts trying. His hand is really, he's really in a lot of pain. He starts trying with his left hand to pull feathers out of his wings. The dust, you can't see anything. The eagle is attacking this arm, the right arm. And the same thing happens with that horrific beak. Big, huge cuts are being put in his arm, all the way to the bone. Blood is running all over everywhere. The place is going, you can't even see through the dust. And Otter finally can't stand it any longer and lets go of the eagle's leg. And the eagle's been beating his wings and screeching the whole time, and when the pressure's off his leg, he flies up. He flies up and out up the valley. Otter staggers to his feet. He's got dust and he's had blood dropping into his face. He can hardly see. He's starting to go into shock from these wounds on his arm. He staggers to his feet. He knows he's got to get to the rocks, and he's disoriented. Okay, he can't figure out where Fawn is. The eagle goes out about 50 yards, turns, and starts beating its wings, coming in very fast, right for him. Fawn sees all that's happening, and the eagle is so fast, she realizes the eagle's going to attack Otter. And she strings her bow really quickly, bends her bow, puts a string on it. The eagle gets to about the distance from this wall to that wall from Otter, and is coming in really, really fast, probably about 30 miles an hour, coming in really fast. And as he gets to be, and that distance is probably about 30 feet. As he gets, her hand moves so fast, you probably couldn't have seen her hand move. She takes an arrow out, notches it in the bow, and shoots. And the arrow goes over the eagle's head. And he's closing now. He's, in the time that it took to do that, he's closed 10 feet. Her hand is a blur. You couldn't even see it. Notches another arrow, shoots right under his head. He's now 10 feet away. He's set his claws, his talons, right for Otter's face. Okay? He's coming in right for his face. She pulls the third arrow, notches it and shoots, and hits the eagle right on the side of the head, just before impact in Otter's face. And what happens is the eagle gets knocked sideways. The arrow hits him hard. The eagle gets knocked sideways, and his wings go up, and he crashes into the sagebrush. But he immediately starts beating around to get out of the sagebrush. She runs out from the rocks. She doesn't dare grab him by the otter by the arms, right? She grabs him by the neck and pulls him after her into the shelter of the rocks and puts him in first and backs in front of him. Now, the opening of the rocks was small enough that the eagle couldn't get him, because what the eagle did was it got up in the air again, and for the next 30 minutes it was mad. This eagle was really mad, and he came in and he tried to get at her, okay, but he couldn't. She could get far enough back in the rocks that he couldn't get her, but he didn't stop trying. He'd circle around and come in again, screeching. He was really mad. But he finally gave up and flew up and landed on the nest, only this time he didn't look up the valley. He was pointing straight at him. And he just waited. And they waited. And time went by. And it got to be about 9 o'clock. It started to get dark. By 10 o'clock, it was dark. And the eagle, they couldn't see the eagle wouldn't fly at night. So the eagle went down its nest. So Fawn gets Otter out, who is in and out of consciousness. His wounds, she had managed, when the eagle went up on the nest, she managed to tear some of her shirt and wrap his arms, okay, to stop the bleeding, wrap him tightly to stop the bleeding. He's in and out of consciousness. She wants to get him down the mountain, okay? He says, no, we've got to get the feathers. And so they went out and gathered all the feathers scattered around the sagebrush that they could find in the dark. And they got a big sheaf of feathers. And she hung on to them, got their bows and arrows, and helped him down the mountain. Now, it took them about 3 hours to get up the mountain. They didn't get down to the camp until about 6 in the morning. It was more or less 10. Maybe they left by 10:30, okay? So it's 6 hours from midnight, so it's about 7.5 hours it took, because he was in such bad shape. And by the time they get down to the camp at 6 in the morning, he's starting to burn up with fever. Okay, so she lies him down, covers him with the sleeping blankets, runs to the stream and gets water and leaves and makes a compress, which is a sort of a bandage of cold leaves, and puts it on his forehead, okay, to try and keep that fever, keep cool, so that try to break that fever. And she goes down the stream and finds plants that are good for healing wounds. And she comes back and heats them and makes, in part makes something for him to drink, but in part makes bandages. But she doesn't put them on him. She goes out in the forest, and it takes her about 2 hours to find, up in the top of a tree, a big bee's nest. And she builds a fire at the bottom of the tree, a very, very smoky fire with moss and stuff that puts smoke all the way up to the top, up to the bee's nest. And the bees don't like the smoke, and they leave the nest, most of them. And she climbs up the tree, breaks the nest, and gets honey and honeycombs out of the bee's nest, okay? And she carries it in a big piece of bark that she had brought for that purpose. She carries as much honeycombs and honey as she can carry and brings it back to him. And what she does is she spreads the honey all over his arms, okay? Now, what we know is honey has a huge property for healing. The next time you get a cut, put honey. Have your mom or you put honey on it and a Band-Aid over it. Watch what happens. She covered his arms with honey. Then she covered them with these plants that she had found and reheated and made them warm. And then she went down to the stream and she got clay mud and covered his arms completely over all the wounds with muddy clay. And so what you have is a cast on each arm, because as the mud and clay dried, it became hard and became a cast, just like a modern cast. And so it took about a day, about 2 days for the fever to break. And about the third day, he started to come out of it a little bit. And by the fourth day, he was able to sit up, and she was able to give him some food. He had had some really bad wounds on his hands, but she hadn't. His hands weren't too bad. It was mainly because his hand was around the leg of the eagle, and the exposed part that the eagle could get at was his arm. So his hands were pretty good, so he could eat and stuff. And about the 6th day, they started for home, very slowly. And they'd taken them 3 days to get there. It took them 5 days to walk back to the camp. And so by the time they got back to the camp, just before they got back to the camp, the cast started to get loose because his arms were swollen inside, and when his arms started shrinking, the cast started to get loose, the mud started to get loose, and she tapped the mud, and it broke away from his arms. And he had the wounds, but the wounds were already coming together. The flesh on either side of the big cuts was coming together, and there were nasty looking red wounds, but they were all starting to heal. And so they get back to the camp, and there's a huge celebration. Now, the people in the camp were never worried about these kids, because these kids could go out by themselves in the forest. They were totally skilled at being alone in the forest. The camp never worried about that. So they got back, and there was a huge celebration. They had a big party, a big feast that night. And Otter had to get up in front of the band and tell the story over and over and over again about what had happened. And finally, he was getting pretty tired because he was still weak and everything. It was probably, by our time, probably 11 o'clock at night. They had a big fire and everything, and everybody was around it. And the approval of the Indians was different than our approval. You know, we clap and stuff like that for approval, but their approval was different. And one of the ways of giving approval was doing this. Huh, huh, huh. And so when he'd tell the story, he'd hear all around, all from all the people, huh, 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 which meant, you know, like approval, applause. And so they ended the feast. But before they did, the three chiefs who were in charge of the three leaders who were in charge of the band called him forward. And they said, we're going to take these feathers and we will have a headdress of feathers made for you. And you're no longer to be considered a child. You have become an adult in the tribe. You will now have the status as a warrior in the tribe, and your name will be Eagle Feather. And they got a lot of approval for that, and everybody was going to turn, and they called Fauna. And they said, you have done a very brave deed yourself, and your status has changed. You are no longer a child in the tribe. You are an adult in the tribe, and you will become the first woman hunter that this band has ever had. And your new name will be the woman whose arrow does not miss. And that is the end of the story.